What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and I kind of previewed this on my last show on Friday, looking at the new coaching hires for Tulane's coaching staff heading into the 2024 season, looking at what the defensive coaches are kind of looking like and trying to infer what we might be able to see coming out of Tulane's defense next year. And the number one thing that I really stuck onto was the fact that Tulane has now hired both an inside linebackers coach and an outside linebackers coach. Taylor Polk being the inside linebackers coach. He's also the co-defensive coordinator alongside Greg Gasparato. Then you have Bam Hardman coming in, who is the defensive run game coordinator and coaching outside linebackers. So looking at what those kind of coaching positions mean, you would sort of assume a 3-4 defense because you don't really have the same need for that many coaches in a 4-3, a 4-2-5 type system where you might have a 4-3 and have a little bit of diversity there, but to have two separate coaches really, to me, spelled potentially looking towards a 3-4. So for this episode, I'm kind of diving into what a 3-4 looks like, what the philosophical change would be there, and whether or not it is the right move for Tulane. Still trying to fill out their depth chart on the defensive line. There's been a ton of transfers on the defensive side of things, but most of them have been defensive backs and that spear role, which I tried to look at some of Troy's games from last season to try to figure out what that spear role really is. And it's safe to say that it is close to that anchor slot role, what have you, but definitely lining up a little bit on the line of scrimmage more. And just kind of thinking of what the traits are for there. But then the opposite side of things has this bandit role, which is the one that's really intriguing me. And I'll be curious to see if that gets carried over, because all things considered, you have a new head coach coming over and he's bringing over his defensive coordinator and all of those coaches from Troy, because a lot of the time you have a defensive coordinator come in. Let's look at last year, for example, for Tulane, where Sheil Wood came in as the defensive coordinator coming over from Troy, where they were running a 3-4 system, but Tulane really primarily ran a 4-3, and they weren't exactly built for a 3-4 system. It's not just plugging in players into different positions and just throwing your hands in the air and saying, you're a defensive end, but now you're doing that in a completely different lineup with a completely different responsibility, whether or not they're responsible for one or two gaps, whether or not they're able to rush the passer anymore. The big switch when you're looking at a 3-4 is that defensive line really has to be a bunch of selfless guys that aren't going to really mind the fact that their sack numbers are about to go down. And in the age of stats and PFF grades and what have you, the nuance that it requires to really see the value in those 3-4 linemen is definitely a lot harder. And so you do kind of run into the question of, well, are the players going to be adept at doing so? And are they going to be willing to do so as well? You obviously can do whatever you want as a coach, but I think playing the players' strengths, that's really what I'm going to try to get into here. Just looking at, again, what those roles might look like and whether or not that is the best move for Tulane heading into next year, or sticking with what they have and trying to kind of figure out what their new scheme will look like. When you're looking at, for example, players going on to the NFL draft, when I've been in the scouting academy grading players, you have to really not just grade what they're able to do on the field, but what type of scheme fit that they would be able to play in. So looking for, again, a 3-4 lineman is completely different than looking for a 4-3 lineman, for example, and what traits go into that, the necessary size at each one of those. And sometimes, even though a coach might have a really strong philosophical calling for one defense or another, depending on what you inherit, that might not necessarily be the best move for your team. A lot of coaching is, I think, a balancing of your ego and approaching what's uncomfortable to you in order to serve the best interests of your team. One of the books that I always recommend to people when they're trying to learn the game of football, Take Your Eye Off the Ball by Pat Kieran. It's just loaded with such good insight, not just on how football is really broken down position by position, what all of those groupings really mean, but he adds in these anecdotes of when he would go down to the Senior Bowl, looking at certain players, and it really helps paint a picture and understand the game of football, and has really been just instrumental to my understanding of the game as I know it, because I would hear, and I'll be honest, I had no idea what a 3 tech, a 5 tech was, and there really isn't anyone that, well, there are people, but you'll just hear a broadcaster say it. And for the longest time, I didn't really know what I was hearing. And it's hard to then kind of audible something on TV and Google it. It wasn't really until I started the scouting academy, especially working on defensive line, that I really came to understand what that numbering system is, that 3-tech role being on the outside shoulder of one of the guards with that whole numbering system. And that's really where you look at where it's an over versus an under front and where guys line up both in a 4-3 and a 3-4. But getting back to the idea of that book, Take Your Eye Off the Ball, looking at the difference between the two defensive fronts, he starts with a really good story about Mike Tomlin, who I think is just a great coach to look at for a lot of reasons. But first time head coach doing this, it was really incredible to read about, where he comes over after being the coach at Tampa Bay for their defensive back unit and was such a Tampa 2 4-3 guy. Well, the team that he inherited over in Pittsburgh was entirely built for a 3-4 system. So you have two choices there. You could spend years implementing a 4-3 system that's going to destroy everything you built on a roster and set your team back. And it's just really hard to kind of find those available guys. You can a lot of the time switch guys that are defensive ends in a 3-4 system over to a 4-3 defensive tackle role, where you line up kind of similarly. It just is different on what you do in terms of being asked to either penetrate or occupy blockers, what have you. But that would have just required so much more work. And I think a lot of coaches would have done it anyways. Mike Tomlin just decided, I'll do a 3-4 defense. And that, especially as a first-year head coach, that to me is super impressive. But it's the idea of, what are the players on this roster the best at doing? And how can I change what I'm trying to implement in order to fit their talents? And that's really how the bandit role actually came out of things. Just kind of looking into the history of that is actually created by, or in spirit for DeMarcus Ware when he was playing in college, where the bandit role before he came on the scene was mostly in that type of, dropping back into coverage situation. But they got DeMarcus Ware in there, put him at the bandit role, and realized how good of a pass rusher he was, and kind of changed that entire idea around that. I'll dive into a little bit of that more, because that's the role that I'm really curious about for Tulane's team next year. So again, looking at what they're bringing over from Troy, looking what their roster was like, looking at how they name these types of positions. Well, they have two defensive end roles, and then they have their nose tackle. And a lot of the time, a nose tackle can be in a 4-3 or in a 3-4, but then they have the bandit role on that line of scrimmage. Then they have their two linebackers, which it's not really a 3-4 or a 4-3. I'm not entirely sure at this point. It really just depends on what you do with that bandit, what they're being lined up and being asked to do. But you also have this spear role coming over for Troy. And I tried to watch a little bit of Troy's defense, both against Army, which I quickly realized not entirely a futile exercise, but when they're continuously running the triple option, it's just a different style of your players lining up, and a lot more in the box for Caleb Ransaw at that spear role, who's a guy coming over from Troy, as well as Chris Rogers, who backed him up at that role. And again, that's a hybrid linebacker, safety, cornerback role, where it's probably more of the former two than the latter one. I just don't feel like usually when someone has good enough cornerback skills, but they're not entirely there and they're a lot more cerebral, well, then you have your safety. It's not always like that, but that's typically when they're lacking the elite quickness in their feet, their ability to remain in phase and man coverage, but they can diagnose plays, come downhill to make tackles really well. You move more over to safety. And so if we're adding linebacker into the equation there, it's hard for me to think that they have the coverage skills of a cornerback while also being able to rush the passer, shed blockers that might be linemen, and make tackles in the run game. It's a question for me. So I'm going to be really, really curious watching that position. But the bandit to me is really the key that unlocks Tulane's defense next year. They have one of the defensive linemen coming over from Troy, Deshaun Batiste. He played one of those defensive end roles, but they don't really have anyone positioned at Tulane necessarily slotted in that bandit role. Just looking kind of over the depth chart and looking at who's coming back for Tulane, you have Angelo Anderson on that side of things, but he had Darius Hodges, Keith Cooper, Devin Deal. Those were all guys that were primarily the starters in that dog role on one side with Devin Deal, and I believe it was Darius Hodges behind him, and then Keith Cooper on the other side with Angelo Anderson backing him up. Tulane was running this kind of two-man rotation, and then you had Eric Hicks at nose tackle, Patrick Jenkins switching off with Cameron Hamilton at defensive tackle. And so just trying to kind of look at who would play bandit in this role. Is it the dog position? It's definitely something that I think is curious. And I said before on the podcast that I did last week that Devin Deal would have just been perfect for this position. But, when you look at the people that were in the dog role for Tulane last year, again, that was Devin Deal, and then he was backed up by Darius Hodges. Then behind them were Matthew Fobbs-White and Michael Luns. They played a little bit in the Military Bowl. We haven't really seen that much from them. So it's a question of what they're going to be able to do. And then you're just kind of looking at who fills out those defensive end role things for Tulane. It's certainly a question. So it'll be curious to me. You have all these new coaches coming in, but you have mostly the same players on that line from last year, especially on the interior. It's hard for me to really identify and say that Tulane has a true nose tackle outside of Adonis Freelou. You just have to be tall enough, and you have to have the size to be able to occupy double teams. You're frequently doing that as at nose tackle, and they're usually lined up as either a 0 or a 1 tech, which is either head up over the center or a little bit shaded, depending on which side of the formation. But if Adonis Freelou goes down for Tulane, I don't really know who backs him up. You'd have a smaller player in someone like Patrick Jenkins that might be able to play that nose tackle role, but it is getting kind of into the territory of, are we kind of fitting players into square pegs here? And that's just something that I'm going to be really curious about, especially when you look at a 3-4, it's all about the linebackers. And Tulane's linebacker corp right now is a little bit thin, and I'm not really sure who kind of adds into those, what would be, those 4 linebacker roles, where, again, if I'm looking at this at Troy, it's really hard nowadays because you have so many names for positions. And just look at Tulane switching from slot to anchor to now spear. I think that anchor and slot were pretty interchangeable. I think spear is going to be interchangeable enough, but there are teams that use bandit as a completely different name and a completely different type of player than I think we're going to see in this one. What they do kind of remind me of are outside linebackers in a 3-4 system, which are your premier pass rusher guys, where they have the speed to bring the pressure off the edge, they have the strength to take on tackles, and they do have the athleticism to drop back into coverage, because that is something that bandit role is going to need to be able to do. And then those inside linebacker roles, I think you could safely say that Jesus Machado and Tyler Grubbs will be able to slot into those 2 roles, but finding the right pieces to me is really the key here for Tulane. And yes, you might be able to switch guys over, but I'm just not sure what the cost might be. Another story that I really liked in the take your eye off the ball part about putting guys in which system was when he went down to the Senior Bowl in 2009, BJ Raji was coming out of Boston College and was being looked at as a defensive tackle. And what he saw was he had a really good first step, and that burst off the line of scrimmage, that initial quickness off the snap, that's really necessary. Not so much in a 3-4, but definitely in a 4-3. And he was able to get into the backfield. And so Pat Kirwan asked this player whether he'd rather play in a 2-gap system, head up over a center, or be turned loose to penetrate. And he wanted to use his quickness to get off the ball and penetrate. And so that is an ideal 4-3 defensive tackle versus a 3-4 defensive end, for example, or nose tackle. But Green Bay was switching over to a 3-4 system and saw BJ Raji as that nose tackle in order to do so. He was a little shorter than you'd like at that nose tackle role, and you don't have any ability to utilize your quickness. I mean, you're legitimately not using that trait whatsoever. And he struggled for his first few seasons. They switched him a little bit between defensive tackle and defensive end, but he did weigh enough at the end of the day to play nose tackle in a 3-4 system. But at the end of the day, not every player is going to be able to really switch back and forth like that. And sometimes you get into those kind of hybrid positions where there are a lot of teams that move safeties over to linebacker. And again, I think we're going to see a lot of that with that spear and that bandit role. But looking at who Tulane really has on this depth chart, it's definitely going to be a curious question for me as to who really fills out that bandit role for Tulane. Now, again, the most important thing above all is buy-in. And so I'm going to assume that all of these conversations were had with the players. And it really stuck out to me that some of the first players that announced that they were returning were linebackers, Tyler Grubbs being the first one, Jesus Machado really soon thereafter. But a lot of guys on the defensive line all agreed to coming back for next season. And so whatever scheme Tulane ends up running, you at least are confident that the players that are there are going to be bought into whatever they're going to end up doing. But just looking at the pedigree of what these guys were able to produce over at Troy, if you look at that bandit position under Bam Hardman, their bandit was named to the All Sun Belt first team in 5 of his 8 seasons and earned all conference honors 8 times, including both bandits earning honors in 2020, 2021, and 2022, one of them being the Sun Belt Defensive Player of the Year in 2016. And Taylor Polk with the inside linebackers guided Carlton Marshall to become the all-time leading tackler at the FBS level, obviously in addition to the Sun Belt and at Troy. Was named Sun Belt Best Defensive Player of the Year and was a finalist for the Burlsworth Trophy. So having these 2 guys come in and work with those position groups is really exciting for me to be able to really look into. But it just keeps going back to that bandit role and who on Tulane's team is going to play that. And then again, if they're switching to a 3-4, what you do with all the guys on the roster. What sticks out the most to me is that Tulane actually has a bunch of guys that could play defensive end in a 3-4 system. Usually that's your defensive tackles in a 4-3. So looking at guys like Patrick Jenkins and Cameron Hamilton, they have the size in order to do so. And you still kind of play a similar role depending on what's asked of you. Oftentimes you end up playing like a 4-3 defensive tackle where you fill your gap, you beat your blocker, and you can penetrate into the backfield, much like we saw those guys do all year long. Then you have your nose tackle staying as it is with Eric Hicks, Adonis Freelou, whoever ends up playing that spot out. And then looking over at the defensive ends for Tulane, I think that's really who you start trying out at that bandit role. And it reminds me again a lot about outside linebackers in a 3-4, where those are the ones getting the sacks. Those are the ones that are finishing plays off the edge and can oftentimes be your premier pass rushers. It's really hard to find a guy with all of the requisite traits out there. And that just matters no matter if you're in college, no matter if you're in the NFL. You just look at Taysom Hill being such a wild card in what he's able to do. And so having 2 outside linebackers on a team that are able to both drop back into coverage and really stop the run and be able to rush the passer at the same time, that's what you need out of your outside linebackers in a 3-4. A lot of the time you'll have a coverage run stopper on one side and a pass rusher on the other. And if I'm looking at the tea leaves here, to me, that's a spear and the bandit role, where the bandit is your pass rusher and the spear is your coverage / run stopper guy. And looking further at that, the fact that they are bringing over those guys that play that spear position already from Troy really makes sense for hammering this all out. And then you just probably have a lot of competition going on there. But it's going to be really interesting seeing what this new coaching staff does with these players and, whether or not they're going to be really interested in playing towards a scheme or looking what each player does best and what they can do. Again, just looking back at the Scouting Academy, the most important thing that they really teach us is looking for what a player can do well. You have a can and a cannot section, and your cannot usually has to do with whether or not they're able to fit into one scheme or another, but you look at traits first, and then you look at scheme second. And I guess that's scouting versus playing on the field, but as they really taught us, it doesn't take any skill to bring a guy down. What's much more difficult is looking at those guys that might be a little further down that aren't so well-rounded and seeing what they can do, what they are able to do. Where again, if you don't have someone that can do all of those things at all of those roles, then you kind of switch it up a little bit. So that's where you get the spear and the bandit role coming into things. But the buy-in to me is really, it's going to be super important for this defense heading into next year. And it's one that I don't feel like I've gotten that much information about the defensive front, at least, where again, I remember that Shield Wood came over last year. I was really curious about whether or not Tulane would switch to a 3-4, but it's different when you have Willie Fritz at the top, who runs his 4-3 fronts relatively often. You have the guys in place in order to do so. And so you just have a defensive coordinator coming over. It makes a lot less sense for me to do an entire scheme change, but now you have a head coach coming over from that Troy system. He's bringing his entire coaching staff with them. They're bringing the entirety of their spear position with them as well. And then Tulane has lost a few starters on that defensive line, and it's just not a surefire thing, kind of what that grouping is going to look at. You look at guys like Matthew Fobbs White, and let me just pull this up because I don't want to get this wrong here. Jari Garner, they we're listed, on our depth chart sometimes, most likely or most often at that dog position, again, behind Devin Deal. And other times, one or two of them would get moved over to the defensive end role on the other side, where Tulane was suffering some injuries last year. And so you were moving them kind of all over the place. But I'm just trying to kind of think of who Tulane's best pass rusher is that they had left, because you got just so much production out of Devin Deal, Darius Hodges, and Keith Cooper on the edge. And it's a question of whether, a lot of the time those players allowed the inside to really get off and vice versa. But you had everyone just working so well in concert last year with Cam Hamilton, Patrick Jenkins, Eric Hicks on that interior, and then those guys making plays on the outside. So if you switch over to a scheme that really relies on those edge players, and then you don't really have that many of them, it is going to be very intriguing and something that I'm going to be paying some serious attention to going into spring camp. But it's just another thing where when I'm looking at what I've been able to learn in this position as a sideline reporter in my coverage of a team, just thinking about this time last year, yeah, you're replacing Nick Anderson, Dorian Williams. You did lose some guys on the defensive line, but I think the question was a little more who was going to be filling out those roles at the middle of the field, at that linebacker role and the safety positions, as well as that anchor position for Tulane. And they solved those with flying colors last year. And it's kind of crazy because you're losing all of these guys at defensive back with Lance Robinson, Jarius Monroe, Cam Pettisflow all going on to the draft. But the amount of defensive backs that are transferred in for Tulane, you just get the sense that there's definitely going to be a ton of position group competitions, but that's not something that you would really have to worry about that much. To me, it's really looking at the depth at linebacker, and then depending on how this position grouping all turns out, looking at each depth there and whether or not you kind of have undersized guys playing different positions. I found it interesting that Jared Small, one of the linebackers for Tulane, ended up transferring out this year because he played such a key role in the defense the second half of the year. And you'd get the idea that he would definitely get some playing time in the system. But even though a 3-4 means that there's 4 linebackers out there, it's not the same type of guy. And again, you get into those kind of different position group names. And I think that's what we're going to see a little more over at Tulane. But the Bandit being the key to Troy's offense, and just looking at how versatile they were lining up on the line of scrimmage. They were oftentimes lined out relatively wide in a 6-tech role, lined up directly over tight ends sometimes. And their body type is a little different than your exact defensive lineman, where you can be a little skinnier. You can be, I think, a little more lean in that instance. But whether or not you have the functional strength to really take on those tackles and those blockers, but seeing really what the pass rush skills are going to be there. We saw them drop a little into coverage for Tulane. Devin Deal would do that relatively often, but that'll be something that's really curious for me heading into spring camp, is where all these guys are going to end up on this team with 2 linebacker coaches, with the defensive run game coordinator who has put all of these Bandits in really, really good spots in order to succeed, bringing those guys over at that spear role, and then looking at the guys that they have filling out that line, including those linebackers. It's definitely a question. It's one that I have to kind of wait and see for spring camp, just because, again, there's only so much you can do looking at Troy on tape. I mean, I was doing that, but there's only so much value to me in really evaluating the defensive end for Troy that's not going to be coming over to Tulane, but also we're just not knowing what these positions are that these guys are going to be able to get in. So I'm really excited for spring camp and getting more of an idea of what each of those groupings are going to look like. So I'll be able to kind of outline this more, but I'm starting again, working on the scouting academy, working on the defensive line. And to me, and I talked about this when I did that whole sideline reporter video, that to me has been such a difference maker in my ability to cover this sport, where there are so many skills that you can pick up in this industry to get better at what you do. And as someone that came into this industry with literally no experience in broadcast journalism and radio or anything like that, I really just went in completely blind my first season. And I just remember thinking, I'm not really seeing things that well. I know football, but I don't feel like I am getting enough out of this vantage point. Seeing how much closer I am up to things, being able to see things like hand usage and their feet off the line of scrimmage, I just really wanted to understand what I was looking at and be able to evaluate that more. And that's primarily why I got into the scouting academy. I finished off the defensive back group. And so that's usually why I focus on that position grouping. But the defensive line is its own beast. Learning about all these fronts, all these systems, it is really difficult. But I know that there are people out there that are looking to learn the game more in depth. And I found that doing the scouting academy, looking at what players do at the best level in the NFL. Yeah, you're not going to see that entirely in college, but when you're able to follow along with a team and know these guys day in and day out, be able to go to practice, which I know I get a lot more of than what people listening to this are, but that's where I kind of hope to bridge that gap where I want to be able to bring in my education on that, look at how Tulane's defensive line, how their linebackers, how their pass rush next year, who's dropping back into coverage, what that spear role does. That's different, I guess, from an anchor or a slot role in order to be kind of considered that 3 position group role. That all to me is just so much more and bolstered by explaining the stuff where, as I said at the beginning, I had no idea what anyone was talking about at first when they would just say a 3 tech, a 5 tech, a 6 tech, where there's even numbers, that means you're head on over someone. Odd numbers mean that you're on the outside shoulder of a player, and then they add an I to the numbers and you're on the inside shoulder of the player. So just having that kind of down really helped me be able to then look at the difference between, again, a 4-3 and a 3-4. And it took me a really long time. And I almost do hope that Tulane switches over to this position group or to this scheme, because it'll just really allow me to dive into that much more. But before that, really looking forward to covering the Senior Bowl this next week too, because I know Tulane fans are going to be very interested in some of those guys attending. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid too. Well, if you know me at all, then you know 2 things. 1, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And 2, if I were in it for the money, well, then believe me, I'd be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I do love Blue Oak Barbecue. The food, the drinks, which I've tried, several of both, the people, the location, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites, from the smoker, fantastic sides, and awesome bar specials I continue to co-sign on each and every week. And so go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, they're located at 900 North Carrollton Avenue here in New Orleans, or you could visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. I don't know if some of y'all saw on X, Twitter, whatever we're calling it nowadays, yesterday, that we were running a promo at Blue Oak Barbecue in honor of their Sunday special, brisket Jabri Bowl. I cannot speak, with those espresso martinis, having a Maddy promo code for $1 off. So we'll be kind of putting those out here and there along with those specials here for the month of January, but going over what you can look forward to this week at Blue Oak Barbecue, heading into Friday's episode. Again, you have the smoked chicken chimichanga on Tuesdays. Their French onion dip is their Wednesday special, and you got baby back ribs on Friday. So I'll be heading down to Mobile on Sunday to cover the Senior Bowl for the week. It's something that I've been doing the last couple of years before Tulane players were getting invited there, for that matter. My first time going down there being after the 2021 season, and not to dunk on anyone from that year, but wasn't very easy to get noticed when your team only wins 2 games. But just like, my first training camp for both covering the Saints I think a year before. No, it was the same year. I'm doing fine. Becoming the sideline reporter for Tulane, because I look at those training camps a little bit differently, answering or asking myself kind of different questions. So everything has been kind of that new first time experience for me. And so my first year in Mobile, I was really just kind of getting my bearings, getting used to the different practices, learning how to kind of look at those things in a completely different setting, but having some of the experience watching all the practices at Tulane, because it really, it's a lot easier said than done evaluating guys when it's a little more truncated and not, a full game setting like you do for the week down in Mobile. But I will just never forget what the experience was like last year for, being myself down there with all of the attention that Tajay Spears got down there. And then what you're seeing these guys do in the NFL this year, with Dorian Williams also being down there, both of them getting drafted in the 3rd round, which is the earliest that any player has been drafted out of Tulane since Matt Forte in 2008. And those are 2 out of the same year. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that gets followed up this next year. And if anything, I think that Tajay really just punched a lot of people in the face that don't look at G5 teams a lot of the time. And maybe they definitely should. But what the Senior Bowl has always been really good about is promoting those G5 guys, particularly at quarterback. I had the opportunity to go down there last year with another position that I held and really get the ins and outs of their process for selecting players. And I'm not going to give anything away, but it's really easy to pick the best quarterbacks and just have a showcase. But that's what, it's more for the opportunity for guys that might fall in between the cracks, that they're able to see those traits. And again, when I talk about the scouting academy, you could still look at a G5 guy and you're evaluating him with the exact same traits. The schemes might be perhaps a little more limited. And you have to take in, for account the level of competition that they played against. But for Michael Pratt, I mean, he has a really strong resume despite staying on a G5 team and being one of those really rare quarterbacks in the age of the transfer portal and NIL. And despite getting offers elsewhere, staying as a 4-year starter, I mean, that's essentially unheard of in college football today. And just thinking about, again, how impressive it is for Michael that he didn't start playing football until high school, and then to be the first player invited over at the Senior Bowl. But that endears scouts to a player, someone that stays in the same program, that goes through it with those guys and went through really hard times on and off the field. But that all matters to scouts, that leadership. It's something that we've all seen in big and small moments with Michael Pratt. But to have the Oklahoma game where I don't care that Tulane lost that game, watching it from afar, I was like, who am I watching right now? When I was looking at Michael Pratt, I mean, he just entered a literal different stratosphere. And then you look at the Kansas State win last year and those wins against Cincinnati and UCF in the conference championship game, followed up by the Cotton Bowl and that South Alabama opener this last year, pretty much sealed the deal. Yes, he didn't get to play in the Ole Miss game, but that's where you start to look at the fact that if he hadn't had those games against higher competition, it might have been more of a knock on him. It might have been more necessary for him to play in the bowl game, consider coming back for a different year. But Michael Pratt, it's not like Tulane runs a one-read offense. And just talking with him, he has such an understanding of the game of football. He knows what every guy has to do, from the center to the tight end lining up over there. He is such a leader. And the Senior Bowl is where you just see a lot of those intangibles. And I know that word gets thrown around. It doesn't necessarily have a good meaning to it, but I'll never forget my first year at the Senior Bowl, just looking at those quarterbacks. I mean, no offense to them, but it was, I believe, like Carson Strong, Desmond Ritter. It was that whole group of people where the only one that looked worth a damn was Kenny Pickett, because he was the only one that wasn't kind of pouting on the field. It was just this weird, you could see the emotions kind of coming out of the quarterbacks, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, quarterbacks are emotional, like kind of have to be, and a little out there to an extent. But just to be so dejected when you miss a pass, I mean, what I'm more impressed by is a guy that then goes and follows up with his receiver, breaks it down, and then runs the play again, or just gets over it, not kind of sitting over there and just looking at his hands while Kenny Pickett is assembling a meeting with all of the wide receivers on the field. I don't know much about quarterback in terms of scouting traits, where again, I'm much more of a defense person, and it's the hardest position group to scout. And I haven't even gotten close to that in my journey, at least on that end of things. But I feel like I'm pretty good at getting a read of what it takes at the position outside of the exact X's and O's. And that was what stuck out to me more than anything else when looking at Kenny Pickett in that Senior Bowl group. Now, did it work out in the NFL? I mean, not necessarily thus far. He was the only one to get drafted outside of the 3rd round that year. And I think it just kind of showed everyone that, yeah, sometimes there is just not going to be a good quarterback coming out of the draft next year. And sometimes your quarterback class is overloaded. I mean, sometimes you have the one that, Josh Rosen and co were all in, and Sam Darnold, and they all went to bad teams and it all kind of blew up. All that to say, it really is just kind of a question one season by another. But I've continued to say that I think Michael Pratt is really going to benefit from the fact that quarterback health was just of issue in the NFL this year. I'm not someone that knows what round guys are going to go in. I can maybe try to ingratiate myself in that community and get somewhat of an idea. I don't know how well everyone really knows at some point or the other, but I think when every team is really kind of looking at that, rather than drafting out of desperation, I think that you have a lot of teams that might not need a quarterback, but now are kind of looking at the reality that you are one injury away from your season being completely tanked. And that's always been something that exists, and it's something that has happened to quarterbacks here and there, but at the monstrous level that it happened in the NFL this year, you're just going to have all eyes on you. And so to have that full week down there, to have the ability to display his leadership and have Jaquan Jackson be down there with him. When it came out about Jaquan Jackson being invited to the Senior Bowl, initially he was listed as a running back. I don't know if that was correct or not. He's now listed as a wide receiver on the same team as Michael Pratt. But I know something that the Senior Bowl does a lot of the time is they will move a guy over to a position group to try to see if they have those traits and put them on notice for scouts, where, you've seen them move guys from center to guard, vice versa. And you saw that, I believe it was Deebo Samuel at the Senior Bowl, that you really saw all of those traits out of him. And I could definitely see Jaquan Jackson being in that same kind of archetype where you can use him in your run game. Tulane did all of the time, but having him as a wide receiver, I know that's something that they like to do as well. When I think back to Desmond Ridder being there, he had Alec Pierce, he had someone else. And that's not to say those guys don't merit invitation on their own, but it helps both of them out a lot more. It's different when Tajay just needs Clayton Tune to hand him the football and throw him. He was actually getting thrown quite a few passes at the Senior Bowl last year. They were working him. But just to have that automatic connection, I think just helps you relax and then really allows each guy to show what they do really well. And, Jaquan has been there as long as I was there with Michael Pratt as well. Both of those guys being on the team since the 2021 year. I'll just never forget, meeting Jaquan Jackson. He's a hilarious guy. He's my first friend really at Tulane. And he just came up to me and he said, "My name's ATM, Automatic Touchdown Machine," talking about his returns for touchdowns, which I did get to see one of those, Quan, against Memphis for homecoming last year. But to have that speed like he does, I think that's really going to be put on display at Mobile. But things are changing for Tulane. This is back-to-back years now where you have two guys going over to the Senior Bowl. Now you have them on both sides of the ball and you have them in that such of an intricate relationship. And so I'm going to be down there and I'm going to bring all those insights over to you guys and we'll kind of see where that takes us from there. But as I'm getting through this offseason and trying to give you guys as much insight as I can, I appreciate you all following along and I will see you all on Friday.